This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds, 5 weeks and counting to the election. I want to talk with you today briefly about two countries with which the United States has an adversarial relationship, Iran and the People's Republic of China. I want to argue that American capitalism is declining, something I have tried to argue for quite a while now. I think the evidence is overwhelming. You cannot cope with the global warming, evidence West Coast fires. You cannot cope with another viral pandemic. The United States has 4% of the world's people and 25% of the world's corona cases and deaths. You cannot cope with your own political system. The levels of division, hostility, and banana republic type maneuvers in this country's politics are a global embarrassment. The gap between rich and poor is at historic highs and getting worse, and I could continue. But I want to focus on the foreign affairs because they give us another dimension, another example of what happens when a capitalism goes into decline. And by the way, the United States is not alone. Capitalism is declining all over the places where it began, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. As capitalism has always done, it moves to from where it's exhausted to where there are new opportunities, from where the profits are falling to where the profits are rising. Nothing new there. Capitalism in America began in the New England area and long ago left that part of the world to focus more on the South, on the Southwest, on the West Coast. You get it. Same process for the Midwest. It came after the New England and it has now been abandoned, which you can see in the empty factories all over the Northeast and the Midwest. And you can see it in England the same way, in Western Europe, and so on. Where did capitalism move to? The new centers of its growth. Asia, Latin America, Africa. The name of the countries, India, China, Brazil, and so on. That's where wages are low and market is growing, and therefore that combination, high profits. So that's where the capitalism is going. What does that mean for the countries that capitalism is abandoning? It doesn't abandon the capitalist system there, it just makes it slow and tired and exhausted, and it plunges the people in those abandoned parts of the world into a desperate struggle. Who's going to go down with the system? Who's going to be able to hold on to the wealth that was created when once it was the dynamic center of capitalism? And so horrific struggles start inside those societies as the rich try to hold on and become richer, and everybody else is left holding the bag of a declining capitalism. The United States exhibits all of those symptoms, but in the foreign arena, a bit differently. Let's take Iran to begin with. A recent interview given to the German newspaper Bild, B-I-L-D, by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo basically says it all. The United States is putting sanctions on Iran. We've been at enmity with Iran for many, many years. It was always justified on the grounds that putting these kinds of sanctions and difficulties in the way of the Iranian regime would liberate that country from its government. It didn't. It would change its policies in the world. It didn't. It would weaken the support in the country for their government. It didn't. It's an endless record of failure, which no government, Republican or Democrat, dares to admit. So they fake it. What do? The latest, sanctions. Any business in the world that does business with Iran will be punished by the United States. go after their assets, cut off their business, sue them in courts, and so forth, sanction them. Let me get this clear in everyone's mind. The United States is telling citizens and businesses of other countries who they can and cannot do business with. Guess what? Other countries don't like that. They don't pass laws sanctioning American companies when they do business with whoever they have conflicts with. That is a no-no, or at least it was. Mike Pompeo says we're doing this to Iran because they threaten Europe. How cute. The German government, which last time I looked was in Europe, disagrees. They don't want any of this. They have an agreement with Iran, which they are satisfied with. And that's true of England and France and Italy and all the other countries in Europe. So the United States is protecting Europe, who doesn't want it, by a policy that Europe opposes. Who then is this policy for? The answer is for domestic consumption. To look tough in relationship to Iran for the American people, counting on the fact that the American people won't be informed, won't know, and won't understand that it is exactly fake news. Why? Because if nothing else has worked, these sanctions won't work either, which is part of the argument why the Europeans don't support them. And finally, just a little detail. When a company wants to do business with Iran and doesn't want American sanctions, here's how it gets out of it. It moves the quantity of goods it wants to sell or buy into the legal hands of somebody else, who trades with somebody else in an endless, murky, unfollowable chain of transactions that finally end up with what had to be traded in the first place. In other words, evading sanctions is a well-known, well-trod path. You make the business more complicated, you add a few of expenses, but you don't stop it, which is why the policy hasn't worked. And basically the same is with China. Look tough, whack the country, whack a business here or there, lots of hyped publicity, get the Democrats to go along because they have no separate policy either on these subjects, because it's the U.S. that's in trouble here. The enmity against China, has it weakened the Chinese government? Not a shred of evidence. Has it changed the Chinese government's policy? Not a shred of evidence. Is it effective? Not even a little. But it continues because it's political theater. It makes a declining power unable to impose its will on Iran, on China, or on an increasingly angry and bitter Europe. It plays at it while making the problems worse. That's what happens in a declining capitalism. Not a pretty picture, and one whose dishonesty is almost overwhelming in the way it glares at you, very much right in the face. The United States is a declining capitalism, and that has to be faced sooner or later when the fakery and the theatrics run out of gas. This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work.